This video is basically a rundown of things that I do before a trip to get ready for the trip. I'm breaking it down into 3 different categories. There are things that I do the day of the trip, things that I do the day before the trip, and things that I do in the days prior to that, before the trip. Let's start off with that last one, the things that I do in the days leading up to a trip. And the first of those is plan. And I'll go into how I plan a trip and how I find things to see in another video. But for now, I'll just say that I use a website called CalTopo, and I use that to plan out points of interest, places I might camp, things I want to see, hikes I want to go on, everything. And so I make a separate map for each trip, and so in the days and even weeks and months before a trip, I work on that map and figure out exactly what I want to see and do. The next thing I do is check the weather. So if it's like 3 days before a trip, I'll look at the weather forecast to see if it'll be raining and storming. Sometimes that's a big deal, sometimes it's not. So for example, if I'm climbing a mountain, I don't want to do that if there's a high chance of thunderstorms on the horizon. Next up is that I will check my car or take care of my car, any things that need to be done. I'll make sure the oil has been changed if that needs to be done, and I'll make sure I'm looking at my car over here, that's where my eyes are going. And I'll make sure the tires are inflated. And this is presuming that all the major things I've already taken care of. These are just a couple little things that I want to double check before any trip to make sure I won't have any issues. And then finally, in the days before a trip, I will plan my meals. I'll look online at recipes and just think of what kind of things I want to eat. Sometimes my trips are very light on the cooking front. Sometimes I don't really cook at all. I don't even take a stove with me. Other times I'm cooking quite a bit. And so if this trip is going to be a cooking heavy trip, I will figure out exactly what I want to eat so that I can prepare for that better. So that's everything that I do in the days before a trip. And then let's move on to the second category, which is the day before a trip. And I have a list here. Let's just go through these. I'll clean out my car. I want to make sure that when I start a trip, everything is nice. You know, it's as nice inside as it'll be. And that just makes the early days of a trip more comfortable for me. Next, I'll get ice and fill up my cooler. I like to do this the day before a trip so that the cooler is like pre-chilled, pre-cooled, so that when I put my food in the next day, the cooler is already cold. And you know, I'm not going to lose a lot of ice that first day. And so what I do a lot of times, well, sometimes, is that I will buy a bag of ice just for that day before the trip, and then on the morning of the trip I'll take that ice out and put a new bag in so that the ice has the best possible chance of lasting as long as possible. Kind of along the same lines, I will fill up my water jugs. I have a big like 4 or 5 gallon jug that I use on longer trips. On shorter trips I have some like 3 liter and gallon sized jugs of water, and I'll make sure that those are all filled up. I keep a couple of them in my car all the time filled up, but if I've used one on a previous trip, or if I'm going to go on a longer trip in more remote areas where water might be hard to find, I will add more water as necessary. I'll charge all of my electronics the day before a trip. So for me, because I make YouTube videos, it's quite a lot of stuff. It's this camera, it is my GoPro, my phone, the drone batteries, my headlamp. I have a USB powered lantern that needs to be charged. So just things like that. And then kind of along those same lines, I will clear off the SD cards that I use to film. So I will wipe those and I'll make sure that the data that was on there is safely on an external hard drive somewhere or in Dropbox or something. And so I have a bunch of clean SD cards for my trip. And then I'll also do the same thing on my phone. So I will clear stuff that I don't need on there so that I have a maximum space on there to take pictures and videos if I need to. And then remember earlier when I talked about CalTopo and how I use that to plan my trips? On the day before a trip is when I will transfer all of that information to my phone. So on CalTopo, there's you have the ability to export the data on the map, so the lines and the shapes and the points of interest. You can export all of that into a KML file or a KMZ file, and those are all things that can be read in a number of mapping apps. And the mapping app that I use for my hiking especially is called Gaia. And so I will import that exported file from CalTopo into Gaia, and then all of my lines and points of interest and everything will be in that Gaia app. And I'll also download that section of map. So for example, right now I'm on a trip in the Deep Creek Mountains in southeastern Idaho, and last night before this trip I downloaded this part of Idaho. I downloaded the Deep Creek Mountains so that I have it offline, so I don't need internet access to be able to view the maps in this area. On the day before a trip, I'll also go to the store and get food. This includes food for the recipes that I'll be making, because I've already figured out what recipes I want to make. And then also just like miscellaneous hiking food and snack food, so chips and protein bars and all that kind of stuff. I have a couple of bins that I use to store food on trips, to store the food that doesn't need to be refrigerated, so I'll put it in there. And then the food that does need to be refrigerated, I put it in the fridge and then take it out the next morning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then of course, one of the major things that I'll do the day before a trip is pack. So I will load everything into the car. Most of the time my bed is already set up in there, and so I don't need to do that. My foam mattress is already in there, but I will move bedding in there, so like pillows and sleeping bag and stuff. I usually take that out of the car in between trips. And I made a list of other things that I tend to move in and out between the car. And so apart from the bed and bedding, there's toiletries, the cooler. Sometimes I'll do that the day before, sometimes the morning of the trip, it just depends. Clothes, hobby gear. So for me that would be fishing gear or kayaking gear, rock climbing gear, hiking gear, whatever I need to do what I want to do on the trip. And then other things like books and just miscellaneous items, I'll move all of that into the car the day before the trip. Let's walk around a little bit as we finish up this video here. So finally, the last thing that I do on the day before a trip is make a list of everything I need to do the next morning. So basically this includes things that I need to move into the car the next morning. This includes toiletries that I need to use that night. This includes some charging cables that I use when I'm at home that I want to transfer into the car. And then that also includes food that was in the refrigerator. So I make a list of everything I need to do the next morning, so that when I wake up the next morning, I know exactly what I need to do, and so that I don't forget anything, because that definitely has happened before. So finally, let's move on to the things that I do the day of a trip, the morning of a trip. Usually I try to leave on a trip in the morning, and so the morning of a trip, I do a bunch of things. I will pack my food, so all the things that were in the fridge, I take it out, put it in the cooler. I do whatever else is on that list of things I need to do in the morning, make sure I have everything that I need, and then basically I get in the car, and I like to know how long each trip is in miles, and so I will reset my odometer, or I take a picture of the odometer on my car, and then I reset the average miles per gallon that my car gets, because I like to know that too. And so I take a picture of that information at the start of a trip, and then at the end of a trip I take another picture again, and so I have the bookends of the trip there, the bookend information, so I can figure out what the average mileage was for that trip, and then also how many miles that trip was. And that's it. That's basically what I do to get ready for a trip. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm sure I left something out, but for the last couple trips I've been making a list. I've been taking notes of everything that I do, both so that I can make a video about it, but also so that I can refer back to the information so that I don't forget anything in the future. And yeah, hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know what other things you do before a trip to prepare for it, and I'll see you in the next video.